So without further ado, I can see that we've got a number of people on who I haven't met before, so I want to tell you a little bit about us. So GP Strategies has been around for over 50 years. We have over 3,500 employees worldwide and have a diverse client base, including aerospace, automotive, financial and insurance, through to life sciences, government and professional services, to name a few. That said, learning performance is not a sideline business for GP Strategies. It's the only business. That's what we do, learning and performance. So that's a little bit about us. You can see a slide there in front of us. We were formed in 1966. We've got over 50 years experience. We're headquartered in the US with over 3,500 employees worldwide. So we do have a truly global presence. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over, talk to you about Paul Matthews. So Paul is a learning performance expert, and he makes ideas come alive with stories, practical tools, and tips everyone can understand. This has led to 2 best-selling books and speaking appearances worldwide. He's an expert in informal learning, enabling capability performance, learning transfer, workflow learning, and onboarding. As I said, there's quite a lot to cover today in today's sessions. Paul, we're very happy to have you here with us, and I'd like to hand over the session to you now. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Noel, and hopefully a 3rd best-selling book coming. It's due out in a couple of weeks, so looking forward to that. And this one's actually the new books on learning transfer, so that fits very firmly into the topic that we're looking at today. Just to start with, let's define learning transfer first. It's really about the application of learning in the workplace following some kind of formal training event, whether that's a face-to-face training, which is pretty typical, or perhaps even e-learning or some other event. And there's a lot of research around about that. One of the ones that's easy to get our head around is the stuff that Robert Brinkerhoff did. And his research showed up that in a fairly traditional scenario with a face-to-face training, around about 1 out of the 6 people in the training room will go on to implement that learning over the long haul. 2 or 3 of those will try it once or twice and then give up and revert to their old behaviors, and a couple out of those 6 will just never ever do anything. And then other figures, they vary quite a lot from quite low to 30 or sometimes even higher, but it does depend on the circumstances and how the research was all set up. But however you look at those figures, particularly when you look at them over the longer haul, like a year after a training course, they're pretty appalling, really. They're actually bad. I started life as an engineer, and if I, as an engineer, was getting that kind of failure rate on stuff I was designing, I'd be killing people. And it's actually really a very bad rate. So, and indeed, any other part of the business that was producing results with figures like that would be under a serious amount of scrutiny, if that was marketing or logistics or production or anything like that. So and I think what's happening is more and more L&D now is becoming scrutinized. It's becoming under the spotlight, which is why there's a lot of talk about ROI and are we doing that and how are we measuring it and how are we making it happen. But of course, ROI is based on learning transfer. Unless you're doing proactive stuff around learning transfer, you're not going to get that return on investment. So learning transfer is becoming very much a hot topic at the moment, which I think is well overdue. And so the question is, why are these figures here? Why are we not doing so well? What's going wrong, or what's not being done? I think one of the things that comes out of this is the fact that we tend to focus on an event rather than a program, a learning event rather than a learning program. And one of the reasons we do this is because we're focused on learning as an outcome rather than performance as an outcome. It's very, very typical I look at a lot of L&D strategies from companies large and small, and it's very obvious they're focused on learning as an outcome rather than performance. And I think that's what's driving some of this sort of event centric way of looking at learning. I had a meeting yesterday with someone who'd actually just come back from their honeymoon. They got married, and And I, I said, well, it was a great ceremony. And he said, yeah, the wedding was wonderful. We had a great honeymoon, but now the work starts. I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, just because we had a great wedding ceremony doesn't for a minute mean that we're going to have a great marriage. And I took this as quite an interesting metaphor to use for learning events. Just because a learning event has been great doesn't mean you're going to get learning transfer afterwards, or even vice versa. If you get a poor learning event, doesn't mean that it's all over. There's nothing else to do. So that's actually quite an interesting metaphor to use. Think about that. No one ever says, oh, what a wonderful wedding ceremony. Oh, that's going to be such a happy marriage. No one even thinks to say something like that. And yet we do that all the time. When we measure learning events, we measure happy sheets, we measure how the learning event itself went, and then say, well, that was a good job, well done. The work's hardly started at that point. And what I mean by work is there is work to do. And I think that's important, to think that we need to be looking at this as a whole end-to-end process, an end-to-end workflow. So one question I like to ask people is this training thing you're doing, how long is it? And they'll say, well, we've got a one-day event. And I say, what are you telling people? Oh, we're telling them we're going to give them a one-day event. And I said, that really is not a great way to start. What you need to be saying is we've got a 4-day program, for example, spread over 6 months. One day of those 4 days happens to be in the classroom. And then think of it as a whole end-to-end workflow. And I use the word workflow on purpose because a workflow sort of by definition is a whole sequence of activities that when they're all joined together come up with an output that is defined. And if you get all the steps in the workflow right, you will get the output that you're looking for. So just think about how you market a program, because of course, if you tell people we've got this one-day event that's going to run, what they will do is in their mind, they will set aside, they'll reserve one day in their mind, in their calendar, their mental calendar, to go and attend that event. And they won't reserve any other time for any other activities or any other parts of the workflow that have to be in place in order for that whole workflow to function properly. So that's just one thing to think about as a program rather than an event. And so what we're looking for is lots of activities spread over time. Now, what we can do now is saying, well, that's all very well, but what are those other activities? How do we make those different steps in the workflow work? What are all the bits in there? What's interesting is that there's actually been over 110 years of research in learning transfer. And a lot of people I say this to are intensely surprised. They say, well, why haven't we heard about this? And I think the research has stayed mostly in the academic domain. It's actually produced some quite complex and sometimes quite variable and even, results that kind of argue with each other. It hasn't really been pulled out and looked at properly. But one person that's done that is Dr. Ina Weinbauer-Heidel from Austria. And I've been collaborating with Ina recently in a few different ways. And what she's done is look at all this research as her PhD thesis and distilled it out. And she's come up with what she calls 12 levers of transfer. And it's a surprise. It's great. So there are levers we can pull. Oh, that's really cool. Now, if we know what the levers are and then we can go and pull them, maybe we can get all these different steps in this learning workflow working well. So let's have a look. Here are the 12 levers that Ina has identified. And oh, by the way, Ina will be speaking with me on learning transfer at the conference at the World of Learning coming up in a few weeks. So she's coming from Austria over to the UK. And this is a slide she's given me to show. So there's 3 levers that relate to the trainees. And that's really about the mindset of the trainee. They need to be motivated to do what they want to do. They need to, self-efficacy is they think they can do it. They think this is possible for me. And volition is an interesting one. The lever 3 there is that's kind of like motivation, but it's the perseverance aspect of motivation. They used to just have motivation as one thing, but in recent decades, they've been dividing it into 2. Motivation is, I want to do it now. Perseverance or volition is, I will go to the gym this morning, despite the fact it's raining and cold, because I know it's a good thing to do, and I sure don't want to do it now, but I'm going to do it because I'm going to persevere. That's kind of volition. And then there's a bunch of levers. You can see there are 4 of them in terms of training design. And what we're going to do is look at some of these levers today, just pull them out and look at them, and I'll put my spin on them. If you want to know a lot more about them, obviously you can get a hold of Ina's book. It's been translated to English and has just recently, in the last couple of weeks, gone on to Amazon in the UK, but it's also available in German. So there's 4 levers there for the design itself, and then there's 5 that relate to the organization. So I'm going to be touching on some of these, but putting my spin on them. Right, let's get on to the next one then. Oops, where's the button? There's the slide button. So this is Mike. He's a friend of mine. It's not a selfie. Mike is, as you can see, is a mechanic. So I'm going to tell you a story here. Just imagine for a moment that you have taxi duty for, I don't know, 10-year-old boy who's got to go to football practice. Maybe he's your son, your neighbor's son, your nephew, whatever. You're taking him to football practice. You drive out of your driveway and you hear a noise under the bonnet of your car that's not sounding good. It's not what you're used to hearing. And so you say to little Johnny in the seat beside you, we're going to take a quick stop at the garage around the corner where I always take my car, and we're going to get Mike the mechanic to go and take a look at it. So there's Mike having a listen to the noise in your engine and figuring out what might be wrong. And he says to you, it's no real problem. There's a little plastic part there. It's got a crack through it. That's what you can hear rattling. I'll just grab one out of the spare parts department and I'll put it in. It'll take 5 minutes and you'll be on your way. And little Johnny's happy because he thinks he's still going to get to football practice. And then Mike comes back and said, I'm really sorry, but we don't have that spare part in stock. So I can't fix your car right now. I'm terribly sorry. We normally have it. Our fault entirely. I will bring that part to you first thing in the morning, tomorrow morning when we get it in by courier, and I'll fix your car on your driveway for free. So that's okay. But then he says, I really wouldn't drive that car any further. I'd take it straight back home around the corner and park it up, because if the rest of that plastic piece breaks off, you could do some serious engine damage. So now you are driving back home round the corner with little Johnny in the seat beside you, not going to football practice. My question to you is, was Mike the mechanic capable of fixing your car? Yes or no? And there's really a couple of answers there, and I find it fascinating how the answers divide out with people. A lot of people say, well, yes, he's capable of fixing it. Not a problem. Okay, he didn't have the part, but he's capable of fixing it. And then another group of people will say, well, no, he's not capable. I'm still driving a broken car. For whatever reason, he couldn't fix it, so therefore he wasn't capable. And think about it for another aspect, another perspective, is what if I was to ask little Johnny, stop crying. We'll get to football practice by taxi. It's okay. We'll manage. But was Mike capable of fixing our car? And little Johnny, in a sense, he's the ultimate customer here. He would say no. So what I'm trying to draw out is the difference between capability and competence. See, Mike is a competent mechanic. He can fix the car if he has all the parts to do so. But right in the moment when he was asked to, he was rendered incapable by the environment that surrounded him, by the fact that the part was missing. It could have equally well been a missing special tool or a missing bit of information or whatever. So we've got to think about how the competence and capability are 2 different things. I'm not trying to redefine them in the dictionary here. I'm just saying that we need to think about them differently when we're looking at whether we need training or not. So if we look at this diagram here, if we are seeking performance, in order for that to happen, the various people involved need to be capable at the point of work in order to make that performance happen. So we're looking for capability at the point of work, in the moment, at the time when someone asked to do the job. And of course, one of the contributing factors there is the performer themselves, in this case, Mike the mechanic. So he has to have certain knowledge, certain skills, an insight and understanding on how to use those knowledge and skills. He needs to be in a mental state, a motivated state to do it, and perhaps he needs some physical attributes such as strength or manual dexterity or whatever in order to accomplish the task. So those things together indicate that Mike is competent. But we still don't know, just because Mike is competent, whether he's also capable at the point of work until we put him into the point of work and find out what else is there that may be, whoops, 2 slides at once, that may be assisting or detracting from his ability to do it. So as well as the performer themselves having to bring their competence to the point of work, also the environment they're working within needs to bring the competence of the environment. We never really hear about competence of environment. We talk about competency frameworks for the individual, but very seldom for the environment themselves. And there's all sorts of things that might be wrong. In my experience, 80% of why people cannot do a job when they're asked to do it comes from the right-hand side, from the environment, and roughly 20% from the left-hand side. I mean, those are really broad figures. But what too often happens is if there's a performance problem, people immediately default to saying there's either something missing in knowledge and skills, and they go down that left-hand side of the page and they start training people without doing this fully blown diagnostics process. And what they end up with is a training course where the content's not relevant, and then it will fail. Because clearly if the content's not relevant, people are not in the slightest bit interested in transferring it or changing their behavior. And so content relevance was one of the levers. Here's a picture that'll help remind you of this. Dennis is very competent as a donkey. He can pull that cart. Trust me, he's a great donkey. But right now he's been rendered completely incapable of doing so by a rather bad manager who's overloaded his cart all wrong. So his environment, in this case his manager, is managing things in a way which means he can't do the job. I think we see that relatively often in normal work situations. So anyway, it's just an interesting picture to remember about how that works. So this is the performance diagnostics part of it. And this is about making sure that in order for learning transfer to happen, we first have to make sure that the learning is actually worth doing in the first place, which is about content relevance. Now, what's interesting about performance consultancy is that it can act as a filter around L&D to save money. Because, of course, if you are doing this diagnostics process on a performance problem and discover that you don't need training after all, you'll end up not delivering quite a bit of the training that you perhaps previously have been doing so. And it's interesting that the companies I've worked with have actually saved quite a bit of training budget as a result of not doing training that they used to do, simply because they've realized after doing this kind of performance consultancy process that the training was never required. Now, only if the training is required and you proved it as a result of a process like this, then you can go into what I term learning consultancy, which is deciding how to deliver the learning, what processes, what channels, what media, and so on. So that's just a bit about one of the levers of relevance. Another one that's interesting is obviously in order to learn things, we've got to do things. People learn by doing. If you ask most people, how do you learn things? They say, well, I learn by doing them. So that lovely expression from Aristotle. But what's even more interesting is this slide where someone's actually finding out for themselves. I mean, you can be told something and over again, but until you actually do it, it's that experience that makes the difference. It's how we experience it. So what we have to think about here is, let's stick with the African theme. We've got delegates leaving going home at the end of the training day. And there's always one clown, isn't there, who wants to take this. So every cohort's got its clown. For those of you as trainers, you know this. So what we need to do is get these guys doing something. They need the opportunity to experience the new ideas, to experiment, to practice. They need to be given the time to do those activities, to experiment and practice. They need to be given the support to do so and the encouragement to do so. Unless that happens, they're unlikely to go and do anything, which means they won't then do and reflect and learn. So this is what practice looks like for a chimpanzee. So just imagine that training course was about bottle feeding tigers. We've got to go and test that out to see how it actually works. You can't learn to bottle feed a tiger cub from a textbook. I don't think that's really possible. Now, you can get the theory, you can do everything, but just imagine yourself in that little chimp's shoes. You're given a tiger cub and a bottle and you're said, here, feed it. It's not until you actually start doing it will you learn a whole lot of new things about how that works. And none of those things in many ways are teachable unless you actually go out there and do it. So this whole point of practicing is such a crucial part of learning, and yet very few learning programs or learning courses or training events have anything plugged onto the back end of them to get this practice actually happening. And many of them don't even have practice in the training course itself to start that process. People actually have to do it and do it several times. And this is part of this quote from Richard Branson, who always has a good thing to say. We want people doing activities. So clearly what we've got to do in order to get them doing activities is to trigger those activities, to prompt them. And what that brings in is some research I've been looking at from a chap called B.J. Fogg, who's a professor at Stanford on a behavior lab. And he talks about if we want a specific behavior, in other words, if we want to trigger an activity, we want to trigger a behavior, if we want that behavior, there are 3 things that have to be in place. And he's drawn a little graph to help us understand those 3 things and how they interact with each other. So the B equals MAP, that's our core formula there in the middle. So behavior will happen if those 3 things are in place. M is motivation, which is the vertical axis there. A is the ability, or at least a perception of my ability to do it, which is the horizontal axis. And P is the prompt to do the activity. Just think for a moment, if I was to ask you to do something, like, I don't know, fetch me a cup of tea or a cup of water, there's a couple of things go through your mind. Immediately you will think, how difficult is that activity to do? Is it easy to do? Is it tough to do? Is it going to be annoying? And so on. So you assess the activity in terms of your ability to do it and how tough it'll be to do. The next thing you do, and this is all unconscious, is you will think about my current level of motivation in order to actually do that activity. Can I be bothered doing that right now, given my assessment of how difficult it will be to do? So what's interesting is, given that crossover of motivation and ability, the prompts will fail in that bottom left part below the green line, and the prompts will succeed above the green line. Now, what I see very often in training programs is where people do want to and try and encourage activities afterwards, they tend to do it by maybe getting people to set goals for themselves, or they set a few activities, usually several bigger ones. Here's a project, here's this, here's that. And the problem there is that these activities are too big. And so they look big, they look difficult to do. And right now, when I'm being prompted to do this activity, it looks big, it looks awkward, it looks like it's going to take me quite a bit of time, so I'm not going to start it now. And if I won't start it now, I still probably won't start it tomorrow either. So the triggers fail. So what you've got to do is, if you are going to deliver activities to people after a training program, and I suggest this is what you should be doing, you need to be delivering those activities in little small chunks so that the perception of how difficult they are to do is low, and then the motivation doesn't have to be so high in order for someone to start doing it. And of course, how you deliver that prompt has a big effect so here's an example. Just imagine I'm inviting you to go to the movies with me. I could just say, let's go to the movies tonight. What I could say, different to that, is let's go to the movies. The Jeff Goldblum is on, and he's a wonderful actor. I know you like him, and it's a really cool film he did. So let's go to that film. So what I've done is I've actually used the structure of the prompt to beef up the motivation to do the activity. So these things are all interrelated, and you need to be thinking about this when you are assigning and setting and delivering activities to people following a training course, or indeed any activities for that matter. Now, what we want them to do is, as they do those activities, to think about them and reflect on them. And as part of that, I've actually come up with a thing I call a learning stack I've been talking about for several years now at conferences. And it sprung out of some work I did for the Law Society on reflection. And I came up with this idea that really, well, not new, I read about it, is that really learning doesn't happen without reflection. And whenever I say that, people are usually quite happy with that statement, that actually, yeah, whenever people learn, there's a piece of reflection involved somewhere. And my immediate response to that was, if we have reflection, can we fiddle with the quality and quantity of reflection, and as a result, fiddle or manipulate or manage the quality and quantity of learning? And I think the answer is yes. So I came up with this 5-level stack here of different levels of reflection. So the lower level, almost submerged there, is what I call unconscious reflection, which sounds like a bit of an oxymoron in a way. But if you imagine, if you keep doing something over and over again, you tend to get better at it, even though you're not consciously thinking about the steps you're taking in order to do that thing. So we have an unconscious targeting mechanism that is, in effect, reflecting for us under the surface. The next level there, level 2, is where we bring it up into conscious awareness. So now we start thinking, well, what happened? How did that go wrong? How did it go right? Who can do it better? The third level is where we externalize that. And that's another level, because in order to externalize it to a diary, to a journal, to the dog on a walk, or to a colleague at the next desk, you have to convert it into language and externalize it out there, which triggers a lot of new neural connections and brain activity. So there's another whole level involved there. Level 4 is where you're still externalizing it, but you are doing it where there is a sense there might be someone judging what you're externalizing. And this is the audience effect that the psychologists talk about, where if I believe that what I'm going to put out there is going to be judged in some way, I will think carefully about what I'm going to put out there. In other words, if I'm going to post a blog, I'll read it twice. If I'm going to talk about this to my boss, I'll think about it twice before I talk to them, and so on. So there's this sense of audience, and that will force us to rethink and just check everything. The 5th level, there's that old adage, the best way to learn something is to teach it. And actually, I don't believe that's totally true. I think the best way to learn something is to prepare the lesson plan to teach it. The delivery of that lesson plan won't give us much more juice. It's designing a lesson plan, pulling apart our content and rethinking it in a way that we can present it to some people who have not seen that content before in a way that they will understand. That gives us a whole new sense and approach to that content, some of which may be, if we're a subject matter expert, so kind of hardwired into us, we just think it's common sense, and we've almost forgotten some of the basics because we don't have to think about them consciously anymore. So that's those 5 levels of reflection, and there they are there, just set up on a slide, but you'll be getting these slides anyway. So what you've got to do if you're designing activities, or indeed any kind of learning intervention, whether it's e-learning or anything, you can look how far up this learning stack am I pushing someone when I'm giving this particular learning intervention to them. And what you'll find is the further up that stack that you can push them, the more likely that learning will stick, the more likely it will generalize, the more likely it will transfer into actual behaviors. So if you think about it, if you just gave someone a PDF to read, you're really only getting to level 2 at the best. You can get to level 3 in a training room because they'll be talking to each other and in little groups, and occasionally you might trigger a level 4 experience, and so on. Coaching, of course, brings in level 4, support from a manager, and so on and so forth. So how can you, with whatever you're doing now, move stuff onto the next level in a way that will help it stick better? Now, another aspect that, again, comes into learning transfer is the mindset of the individuals. And some of you might be familiar with Professor Carol Dweck's work. Again, she's actually a professor at Stanford, and she's been researching this for well over 40 years now, and has got a huge body of papers and research out, and actually a very, very good book on mindset. I would really recommend you read that book. Sometimes I tell people you should read that book before my book, so that sort of shows you how serious I am about it. But she's come up with this model where there is either a fixed or a growth mindset. And like any model, it's just a model. It's not necessarily totally true, but it gives us a handle on things. And it's interesting, she says the world is roughly divided, and it's more or less half and half, but there's a group in the middle that are a mixture, where people with a fixed mindset tend to think they've been delivered a hand of cards by the universe, that they are then, that's all they've got to play. They can't ask for more cards. That's what I've got. I'll do the best I can with what I've got, but I don't really have the ability to grow or change or be better. One of the things that happens when someone's got a fixed mindset is they have this sense that failure is a permanent thing. Failure shows that I've reached the limit of my abilities. I'm either good at that or I'm not. It's like, you know, I'm a hopeless singer and I'll never be a good one. Whereas someone on the other side, on the growth mindset, might say, well, right now I'm a hopeless singer, but if I chose to take some lessons, I could be a much better one. So they have a sense that growth is always a possibility if they choose to put in the work and go there. Fixed mindset people will tend to not try something in case they might fail. So if there's any doubt in their mind that they can succeed 100%, they will back off and not even try. They will also tend to cover up mistakes. And that's interesting, because if they cover up mistakes and hide them, and the reason they do that is they don't want to be seen to be a failure, because of course as soon as I am seen to be a failure, I have this sense of I've reached my limits and everybody knows my limits. So they're all about appearing competent. The other thing that fixed mindset people struggle with receiving as feedback is they'll happily nod their head, but in the back of their mind at some mindset level, they're sort of thinking, well, this is no good to me because I can't really improve anyway. And some of the brain scan experiments that Carol Dweck did are fascinating, where she put school kids through puzzles and then put them in a brain scan and said, here's the results of the puzzles, and these are the ones you got right, and these are the ones, here's your score. And oh, by the way, here's some feedback on how you can do better with the puzzles we're going to be looking at after lunch. And the fixed mindset people, the brain scans sort of dropped back to, well, close to zero. They really weren't interested in the feedback, whereas the growth mindset students were all, they lit up. They just said, oh, feedback, this is great. I want to learn how to do things better. I want to move forward. So there's this growth mindset people are easier to work with in a learning environment, fairly obviously, but with roughly half the population out there that tend to be fixed in their mindset, you need to be thinking about how do we operate with them? How do we set things up? How do we set exercises up and so on? And there's lots of ways to do that. I'd really recommend reading Carol Dweck's book and research this a lot more. There's also a great YouTube video by one of her students on YouTube. His name is Eduardo Briceño. So if you do a search on that, Eduardo Briceño, B-R-I-C-E-N-O. And he gives a nice 10-minute succinct definition of that. Now, another factor within mindset is the culture that surrounds people when they're actually doing these activities. And of course, that culture itself can have either a fixed or a growth mindset aspect to it. And in Carol Dweck's book, she talks about how some of the successes and failures in business, whether the successes like General Electric or the failures like Enron, had a mindset component as to what caused those successes and failures. But one of the things that's important in learning transfer is the expectations around whether people do anything after a training course. I was at one training center a few years ago now, and talking to the head of L&D in a corner having a drink, and we watched some people come out of the training rooms. And I asked him, if I went and asked those delegates coming out of the training rooms, I asked him, if you do nothing with what you've learned today in the training room, what are the consequences? And he looked a bit embarrassed and he said, well, they'd all say there are no consequences. So just think about it. If a delegate goes to a training course and then there is zero consequences of doing nothing with what they were presented on that course, that's difficult. That's a cultural thing. What are the expectations when they get back? And there's lots of ways that we signal those expectations because of the way the culture works. And the reason I've got that piece of that picture there is you can think of the culture as magnets under a bit of paper, and there's iron filings on top. and you can't see the culture. You can't see the values, the beliefs that make up the culture. But what you can see is how people line up as a result of those invisible forces driven by the magnets under the paper, as a result of those invisible forces of culture. So all you can do is observe behaviors and say, okay, that gives us an indicator of how the culture is driving behavior here. So that's why that picture's about. And what's interesting here is, what are your transfer expectations from this webinar? Will anybody notice if you do anything after this webinar? How are you going to hold yourself accountable? And it's really interesting that one of the biggest challenges I find when I'm doing workshops and working with organizations on learning transfer is learning transfer itself is the biggest barrier to them getting it and taking what's done in the workshop outside and onwards into changing the way they're doing their L&D practice. Despite their best intentions, so many don't. And I think I don't know why, it's L&D people just, it's strange. So please be some of the L&D people that really understand this and must move on. So just think through those questions for yourself right now in terms of this particular setup. How are you going to hold yourself accountable right now and for the next few weeks on doing something with some of the ideas that you've picked up from this webinar? It's a really important question. So that's a bit about me. There's my 2 books. There's the new one on learning transfer that'll be out on Amazon in a couple of weeks. Some free downloads off the website. So, and a few other things that we do. So we're a software house as well. So questions, Colin, have you been looking at the chat? I can't multitask, so I've not been looking at it. So are there any questions come up on the system for us to answer now?
Hi Paul, it's Noel. Thanks very much for that. So just before we move on to the questions, we've got some coming through at the moment, which is great. Thanks to Colin for being so active on the chat as well. Lots of good pointers coming from Colin, and agreeing with lots of things that you're saying, Paul, which is good. But I'd just like to take a moment to thank you for a great presentation. If anybody does have any questions, please put them in the QA window now. We're just starting to see some come through, so I'll pass those over to you now, Paul, if you're okay with me reading them out.
Yeah, just read them out, please.
Yeah. So the first one we have is, with online groups now part of our daily lives, do you think there's room, oops, it's just moved up a little bit, bear with me a second. With online groups now part of our daily lives, do you think there is room for more social post-event community groups that can help reinforce learning back in the workplace? I'm part of some great communities post-events on WhatsApp and LinkedIn, etc.
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely, because one of those levers that Ina talks about when she's distilled out all of those learning factors from all the research is not just support from the manager, but support from peers. And that becomes even more critical when you've got geographically dispersed people who may be together in a cohort in a training room, but then disappear off to different branch offices and things afterwards. So that is, I think that social aspect, having some kind of forum or community, however you provide that, whether it's on Yammer or an existing system or within a learning transfer platform like ours or anything else, there's so many different ways of doing that. But yes, critical that you get both peer support and support from managers and others in that same forum environment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. And the next question we have is, have you got any good examples of prompts that have resulted in some good post-learning event activity?
Well, the answer to that is yes. And I think it's just saying, well, here's an example doesn't necessarily help very much. What you've got to do is think carefully about what activities do I want them to do, and then how can I prompt them on those activities given the existing cultural dimension. In other words, am I pushing on an open door, or am I going to have to work harder because they're not getting the support out there from their managers and peers that perhaps would be useful, or indeed from the culture? So how you position those prompts, how you deliver them, what channel you deliver them by, and then how you word them or focus them will have a big difference. The place that's got to start, by the way, is in the classroom. So you need to be actually doing a lot of work in the classroom related to learning transfer and setting people up forwards to do that. And so you'll be able to there saying, here is how we are going to communicate to you, and here are the activities, and you've got a plan in place. So much of it is about planning. But prompts will depend on, does that prompt come from the manager? Should it come by an email? Should it come by a text? Should it come on a social media group? How are you going to prompt them? That's going to depend on the culture and the type of activity you want them to do. So there's no simple answer to that one. It's a matter of sitting and thinking about it, I think, really. Happy to have a chat about that offline if you're interested to explore that one further.
Thanks very much, Paul. We have a couple. We have a little bit of time, so you're okay with 2 more questions?
Oh yeah, go for it. Happy to go.
So the next question is, how important is the role of the manager in learning transfer?
The big one. Vital, actually. If you think about it, if someone comes back from a training course, and I hear about this all too often, they come back and they're at their desk and the manager comes over and says, oh God, thank God you're back. We've been so busy with you away. No one has done your work while you've been gone. So you've got a huge in-tray backlog, and now get on with some real work. And oh, by the way, I went on that course a while back. Nothing in there is useful, so forget about it. Let's get on with what we're doing. That happens all too frequently, where the manager just doesn't have any sense of developing or working with people. You also get the other end of the spectrum, of course, the manager who says, welcome back, let's talk about it. How can you help your colleagues or teammates with some of the same information? And the manager really has a couple of different jobs running there. One is to manage the environment around that person, to give them opportunities to practice that particular task and the time to do so. And then the other thing is to support them in terms of their volition or motivation, but more in terms of their volition. So if their motivation flags, the manager is there as the cheerleader to say, come on, let's go and do this. It's important. Let's get this done. So it's about supporting them as an individual, encouraging and coaching them, but also about managing the environment that surrounds them to help them implement the activities and implement the new ideas and thinking. Otherwise, those new behaviors are not going to happen. And if the training doesn't result in new behaviors, well, unless it was the tick box compliance training, but if the training doesn't happen in new behaviors, it's been kind of wasted. So the manager is absolutely critical. It's a core part of it. And there are some commentators that say, oh, the manager, bless their cotton socks, is not capable of coaching people well enough after a training course in order to make a difference. So we need to spend lots of money on external coaches or train new internal coaches. And I think that's a big mistake, because you're letting the manager off the hook for their job, which is helping the people on their team be the best they can be at the job they're doing. That's a prime directive of any manager. And yet many managers don't have that. So you will often find you have to work with managers in order to generate the right environment for people for learning transfer after a program or after an event.
Thank you, Paul. We have one last question, if I may. Now, this might be a bigger one, so I'll go through it. How do we democratize learning transfer in an organization rather than it be the responsibility of one person? For example, manager, L&D police, etc.
I think that's a great question, because it's one of the reasons I think learning transfer often doesn't happen, is there's too many people involved with too many pieces of the puzzle, and nobody is there kind of directing or orchestrating all those different people to provide the pieces of the puzzle in the right way at the right time. So the manager is clearly one. Other peers, there's people who have an influence on the culture. There's obviously the tutor or facilitator themselves. There's the course designers. There's so many different people involved, right from that early diagnostics phase I talked about through to the final kind of sign-off that this group of cohort of people have now become behaviorally competent in a way that we're happy with, which could be months, even a year or more after an actual event. So all that activity spread over a long time. There are so many people involved. So the question really is, who's going to be held accountable for all of those different people delivering what they need to deliver into the middle, into the pot at the right time and the right way? And so often there's just nobody with an overall accountability. Even if there's a project sponsor, they aren't accountable for the individual actions. So that's one of the big things, is actually managing this as a project or a program with many different mini projects involved. So you're almost into program management phase here. So that would be my response to that, I think.
Thank you, Paul. So I don't think I'm seeing any more questions come through. So I think it's time to start wrapping this up, as we have no more questions. Paul, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us today, and I'm sure Paul, ITOL, and I know GP Strategies would love to keep the conversation going with you all. Paul and ITOL, along with GP Strategies, are all at World of Learning, which takes place mid-October. Paul's speaking, as are some of my colleagues and myself at World of Learning, and we'd love to see you there. I'd like to remind you that this has been recorded. So over the next 24 hours, everybody that's registered, joined, or registered and not been able to attend will be sent a link to the recording along with the slides. And once again, thank you very, very much for joining us today, and I hope we see you all soon on another collaborative webinar with GP Strategies and ITOL. Thank you again, Paul, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you. All the best. Happy journeys.